With Borderlands 4 all but announced at this point and a very cautious level of hype building up, it feels like a good time to talk about all of the things we don't want to see from Borderlands 4. Whether it's insane drop rates, invincibility phases, or the obligatory Ava bad. Borderlands 4 is pretty much Gearbox's last chance to bring this franchise back to life, so they really have to get everything right, or we're gonna have some pretty big issues. Hey everyone, I'm Constant Canadian, and this is everything we don't want from Borderlands 4. If you enjoy the video, then be sure to drop a like and subscribe as it really helps out the channel. First off is something that newer players may not even remember, but it's the insignificant level cap increases. The original Borderlands, just like the rest of them, started off at a level cap of 80, with the General Knox DLC making that 61, and the patch included with the Claptrap Robot Revolution DLC increasing it further to 69. Nice. Borderlands 2 started at 50, and through the 2 Ultimate Vault Hunter upgrade packs increased from 50 to 61 to 72, with an additional 8 being added with the Commander Lilith DLC, finishing at 80. The pre-sequels, pretty similarly, started at 50, adding 10 each with its 2 Ultimate Vault Hunter upgrade packs. Naturally, when Borderlands 3 launched with a base level cap of 5, the community figured it would follow the same pattern. Boy, were we wrong. In Borderlands 3, the level caps were actually free, hooray, but they were also a lot less significant, going from 50 to 53 to 57 to 65, and finally to 72. I think the idea here was to keep people coming back to refarm their gear more often, though it kinda backfired, as up until the level increase from 65 to 72, there wasn't enough difference to justify farming all of your gear again. Having small level increases like this made next to no difference to your skills and just felt like a cheap way to increase playtime on the game. I personally would much rather have 2 bigger increases than 4 smaller, insignificant ones. Another thing that we absolutely do not want to deal with in the next Borderlands game is Anointed Enemies. Anointed Enemies are absolutely 100% the bane of my existence, especially Anointed Militants and Anointed Tanks. These damn things are just not fun to fight at all, with the constant teleporting and shrinking, immunity phases, and borderline undodgeable attacks. It would be one thing if they were not so damn common, but in COV areas, every third enemy is an anointed enemy. The Anointed Militants are especially awful, with not only one full immunity phase, but also an impenetrable shield that is almost always used right when I'm about to get a second wind on a weaker enemy. If there is one enemy I could remove from the Borderlands franchise, it would be Anointed Enemies. They are by far one of the worst parts of Borderlands 3, and they better not be in 4. Speaking of anointed things, anointments are yet another thing that I would like to never see again in any Borderlands game. Anointments on our weapons were a pretty interesting concept in theory, but absolutely sucked in practice, pretty much making or breaking endgame builds due to how important they are to the damage of your character. On top of that, they make farming the different weapons, shields, and grenades of the game an absolute nightmare, as you not only need to farm for the weapon, element, and parts you want, but also one of the 55 separate anointments as well. The anointment reroll machine kind of helped with this, but then the endgame farming became less about farming for a specific weapon and more so about farming for iridium to reroll the weapon you got. It's pretty bad that 90% of the time when I'm farming, my eyes go to the anointment first before they even look at the weapon that dropped. Anointments pretty much ruined farming in Borderlands 3, and if they return in Borderlands 4, then I think we will have some pretty serious issues for the longevity of the game. One of the most boring parts of any Borderlands games for me is the level grind. Nothing kills the fun and immersion of a playthrough more than farming the same enemy or waves of enemies over and over and over again just to reach the max level of whatever game you're playing. If Borderlands 4 is going to be successful, then it needs to find a way to remove this obnoxious level grind from the endgame. I mean seriously, we already spend thousands of hours just playing the endgame activities and farming the various weapons and gear we need for our builds. So it's just unnecessary to spend another couple hundred hours farming for levels before we can even begin this grind. Borderlands 2's level grind was the most obnoxious of these games, but even in Borderlands 3 the level grind can get pretty boring. Whether they just increase XP gain in general or after beating the story, the level grind needs to be a lot less boring and long in Borderlands 4. It's no secret that Borderlands 3 hands out legendaries like candy on Halloween, and while some people do seem to enjoy that, it hurts the overall experience of the game in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, I think Borderlands 2 has too few world drops, but I also think that Borderlands 3 has too many. Borderlands games have always been, for me at least, about farming for your specific gear from its specific source. Not about running the same gauntlet or boss over and over and over again, hoping and praying that one of the 11 legendaries it drops this time will be the one you need. Borderlands 2's world drops were a lot more tame, and honestly I'd argue a little too rare. The fact that I can kill Veracitus the Invincible, the hardest raid boss in Borderlands 2, and not get a single legendary at all is painful. The loot explosions should be very much that, loot explosions. However, I should not be getting 5 legendary drops just from running some random mobbing area on Eden 6. The increased drop rates in Borderlands 3 are kind of important to that game's viability, but I honestly think that's essentially a band-aid for a lot of much bigger issues in that game and creates a whole bunch of other issues itself. If Gearbox wants Borderlands 4 to succeed, then they need to pull back those drop rates, at least just a little bit. Another thing that really breaks the immersion and enjoyment of these games is unskippable dialogue. This has been a problem in every Borderlands games. There are so many points in every game where we are forced to just stand there and listen to dialogue being talked at us for no reason. While this dialogue can be important for the initial playthrough if you care about that sort of thing, which I do, every following playthrough it's essentially just a waste of time and completely kills the action and momentum of the playthrough. Dialogue in Borderlands games should have the option to play in the background, especially since half the time we sit for 5 minutes and listen to dialogue just to go do a mission in damn near silence afterwards. Borderlands 4 either needs to make this dialogue skippable, shorter, or make dialogue play in the background while we do our missions, so that we can actually get momentum going during our playthroughs. Having endgame levels is pretty important for progression. I mean, you have to have something to work towards. However, in recent years, Gearbox has been going overboard with those levels. I'll come right out and say it, 8 overpowered levels was a pretty good place for Borderlands 2 to stop, and the worst thing that happened to that game was adding the additional 2 OP levels. This same thing happened in Borderlands 3 as well. Mayhem 4 was a good place to stop in Borderlands 3, and while Gearbox eventually figured out the balance for Borderlands 3 after Mayhem 2.0 came out, there was still a pretty big period of time where balance was horrible. And yet they did it again, with Wonderlands having 100 chaos levels. Endgame levels are good, but only up until a certain point, and if Borderlands 4 has even 20 endgame levels, then I don't know if the community will even be able to bother finishing the endgame. Loot pool bloating is a huge issue in modern Borderlands titles. Gearbox keeps adding more and more weapons without really giving any of those weapons a drop source, or adding them to another drop source's pool. This is a massive issue in Borderlands 3, with each drop source having 2 to 5 different dedicated drops. This makes farming for weapons way harder than it realistically should be. Borderlands 4 needs to remove the insane bloating that every enemy's loot pool seemingly has, to bring back farming that isn't exhausting. Another recent feature that needs to not return in Borderlands 4 is the time-delayed red chests and vendors. If you don't know, red chests in Borderlands 3, and maybe even in Wonderlands, I'm not too sure about that one, have a 30-minute cooldown after being opened before they become available again. This is one of the most confusing changes that was made in Borderlands 3, as red chest farming was actually pretty enjoyable in Borderlands 1, 2, and the pre-sequel. And while it would have at least been slightly arguable with just the random red chest throughout the world, where it doesn't make sense and is absolutely inexcusable is in the loot rooms after bosses or vaults. What is the point of giving vaults loot rooms if you can only open them once every 30 minutes in game? It just makes absolutely no sense to have a time delay on red chests in these games, and Borderlands 4 needs to remove it. Unless done properly, immunity phases in Borderlands games suck and are unfun. I'm not talking about immunity phases like Anathema or Caster or Wastard or even Captain Haunt. Those immunity phases either give you something to do during them or can be ended at the player's will by switching focus. The kind of immunity phases I mean are the long and boring ones, like Tyrene the Destroyer, Troy Calypso, Kilovolt, and many others. Those immunity phases give you nothing to do aside from ad clearing and waiting for the phase to end. It's just boring and a bad way to make bosses tankier. Immunity phases need to be actually thought out and not just randomly thrown in there to make bosses stronger. If Borderlands 4 does give its bosses immunity phases, they had better be good immunity phases. Borderlands 4 has been confirmed to have been in development for almost 6 years now, so hopefully Gearbox has been paying attention to the community while they've been developing it to make sure it absolutely slaps on its initial release. Is there anything else you don't want to see in Borderlands 4? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day.